called a paradigm shift. And the little cartoon there of Einstein is pertinent because Einstein's ideas created a massive shift in thinking. And that's what a paradigm shift is. It's a massive rethink or a massive turnaround in the way people think about scientific ideas. In Einstein's case, it had to do with physics, but we're going to have a look at some examples today across the breadth of science. So every area of science has had massive paradigm shifts. And of course, this concept of a paradigm shift does come from, like a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, from the area of philosophy and the idea of how we know and how we think about things. And it came from Thomas Kuhn. And in that respect, it's actually quite a relatively new idea. And so, in 1962, he had released a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that book, he really overturned the idea that people had in the past, that science subtly moved from one idea to the other. And we'll have a look at some of those ideas here to really demonstrate that. Because one of the things, as you study more and more into science, you realize science isn't a gradual process. It comes in jumps and starts. And it's really, really important to think about that, because what you usually get in an area is that a discovery is made and there's a huge amount of other discoveries working on the tail end of that. And then science often then gets to a point where it's sort of is slower for a little bit while. You could say it stagnates for a little bit until a new idea comes along and pushes everything along. And, in particular here, the physicists and the chemists will have very common ones, and the biologists as well. It's where a scientific idea can't explain what's going on anymore. And so there has to be a brand new way of thinking about that. And it's also a really important thing to think of, particularly in our modern world, where, we look back on the past and say, well, why did people think this? And they thought that because that's what the thinking was at the time. And a really good example of this is the history of the atom. And the history of the atom is just a really good example of how science moves. And we go all the way back nearly 2,500 years to Democritus. And, he came up with this idea of that, everything was made of small little bits. He used the Greek word atomos, which means indivisible, and he philosophically came up with this idea. He didn't do any experiments, but when you think about it, it would have been really hard for him to do really convincing experiments anyway, because the technology wasn't there for that. And that's another interesting thing about paradigm shifts, is paradigm shifts often occur when there's a new technological innovation, and that technology allows people to do experiments, it allows people to come up with new ideas, and so on. And the reason I've circled that little bit there is, you see, you go from 460 BC to 1803. And so when we talk about the history of the atom, we go from Democritus to Dalton. And Dalton was, an English chemist. He came up with some good chemical ideas, the law of definitive proportions. And he then came up with the modern concept of atoms using the ancient Greek idea of indivisible. And of course, huge gap there. But then you look here, you go from 1803 to 1869, 1885, 1896, 1897, 1907. In a short period of time, we went from Dalton's indivisible atoms to Mendeleev, to Goldstein, Becquerel, when you're talking about radiation, J.J. Thomson with the electron, Ernest Rutherford with the nuclear idea of the atoms, and you go to Millikan and working out charge, then you go to Bohr, Heisenberg, and all these other things here, which really have developed the idea of atoms. In 200 years, which in the space of human understanding is not much, we've gone from not understanding the nature of atoms to being completely confused by the nature of atoms when you start looking at quantum mechanics. And this simple timeline, it only stops at Chadwick with the neutron in 1932, and there's been huge gains since there. And one of the reasons Dalton and then, Becquerel and all these other people were able to make these discoveries is things like technology. Particularly things like the cathode ray tube allowed chemists and physicists to explore what was happening inside the atom. Now, in terms of chemistry as well, one of the big paradigm shifts comes from Antoine Lavoisier, and he's a chemist, and he was the person who came up with this idea of combustion being caused by oxidation. He studied air, and of course, at the time, there people knew there was probably stuff going on with air, and particularly talking about the idea of the prevailing theory at the time was that matter had a thing in it called phlogiston, and it was phlogiston that was burning, and that once all the phlogiston in something had been used up, it stopped burning. Now, Lavoisier looked at the air. He actually created oxygen by taking mercuric oxide and heating it up. He was able to isolate oxygen, and he was able to show that oxygen had specific properties. And he also discovered this idea of the law of conservation of mass. That matter just changes from one form to another. And of course, modern chemistry is pretty much that's the basic tenet that underlies most of what we have in modern chemistry. Of course, in the annals of history, Lavoisier is noted for that there, but his wife apparently did conduct a lot of the research alongside him, but at the time, she was a woman, so it was considered that she was the fairer of the sexes, so couldn't be accepted in any of that stuff for her. We briefly mentioned Einstein before, and that little cartoon started off with E is equal to mc squared, the energy mass equivalence formula. But in terms of how we think about the universe, E is equal to mc squared, very important. But Einstein's general relativity is probably the bigger paradigm shift out of all those shifts that he had there. And of course, Einstein, with his general theory of relativity, said that there was a link between space and time. And normally when you think about space, in terms of the universe, you think there's three spatial dimensions. There's width, length, and height. Or if you want to use a 3D Cartesian plane, X, Y, and Z. It was pretty much accepted. That's a pretty commonsensical thing. That X, Y, you can work out the position of something using an X, Y, Z relationship. Einstein, in the general theory of relativity, said, well, what about if there is a fourth dimension? And so, you got your three spatial dimensions, your X, Y, Z. Einstein said, well, what about if time was an intrinsic part of that? And so in this case here, he came up with the concept of something called space-time. And so in that respect there, if you want to try and explain, say, the position of something in the universe, you need to use the three spatial dimensions, and you also need to use the time dimension. And it's by considering this here as well, he was also able to sort of talk about, well, if space-time is a thing, then something like gravity comes about because of distortions in space-time. And so in that respect there, gravity is almost creating, so a large mass is creating a little bit of a gravity well, which is what is causing the gravitational motion or the gravitational force. And he demonstrated this in his field equations. And so in this case here, because there was a lot of conjecture about particularly the Newtonian idea of gravity, and Einstein was able to generate a paradigm shift that moved to this new idea. And, it's a lot of astronomy and a lot of quantum physics is also based around these ideas. And so this little image here sort of shows this here. So that when you have there your satellite, the part of the gravitational force is caused because of this distortion. And so in this case here, this satellite is constantly falling and moving around this gravity well there. A little bit like those little charity coin wells you see outside some supermarkets. Now, moving away from chemistry and physics, we go to earth science and geology. And Geology is a little different to some of the other sciences in that a good portion of the investigations are observational. It's a bit hard in some cases to do a direct cause and effect relationship with an independent and dependent variable. And Alfred Wegener proposed the idea that the continents were once joined together and had drifted apart over time. And of course, his first observation for that was the fact that if you just look at a map, you can see that some of the continents seem to fit together. The most obvious one is South America and Africa. And that was a really controversial idea at the time, because most people considered, well, the Earth was consistent, it was static, in terms of, the continents and the plate, and the continents were so large that there was no way that there was any forces that could move them. And Wegener had other evidence for that as well. He looked at some of the fossil records. He looked at some of the flora and fauna in different places there. So in Australia, there's an example of, we have the Waratah, and there's a flower in South Africa, which is almost identical to that in a lot of ways. He looked at the fossils and found identical fossils on different parts of the continents. You can also consider the evidence that in places like Antarctica, there are fossils of tropical species of plant and animal. And the problem with this was that because it was such a radical idea, Alfred Wegener's ideas weren't accepted until the 1960s. Unfortunately, Alfred Wegener had been dead for 70 years. So in that case, they're a tragic idea that his absolutely correct idea and brilliant deductive reasoning from the evidence there wasn't accepted till well after his death. And of course, this is what I was talking about here. So you've got here in South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia, there are these bands of fossils, and they show that there's very good evidence, particularly when you put those continents together, that they may have been connected at one point. Our last example here is coming from biology, and biology has a lot of paradigm shifts. You can go back to Charles Darwin, which was a massive paradigm shift about how things changed and how organisms changed over time. But the one we're going to look at is this idea that's come about since the discovery of DNA and the discovery of genes, and how genes are responsible for traits, and Einstein's ideas, and you can go back to Mendel's ideas as well of working with the peas. They're all groundbreaking ideas. And McClintock was studying these things discovered these things called jumping genes, or she called them transposable elements. And little sequences of DNA that sort of jumble up. And so what that is that when you have sexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction in terms of just mixing up genes, you get new combinations. And McClintock really discovered that there was more changes going on that can just be described by half mum's DNA, half dad's DNA. Now, there had been, once DNA had been discovered and people started looking closely at it, there was thoughts that there were parts of the genome that were just junk DNA. They didn't know what they were for. People weren't sure. They thought they were just left over from the way the way humans have an appendix as a leftover remnant of an earlier genetic makeup, an earlier species makeup. And she was looking at these genes, looking at them quite closely. And one of the problems is that particularly, even now, a truly deep understanding of genetics at that cellular, at that atomic level, at that trait level, at that individual amino acid level is incredibly difficult to understand. At a school level, we understand sort of the main ideas. And of course, McClintock was having problems there. She's publishing her papers in the 1950s, when it was still considered that science was a men's thing as well. So not only did she have to overcome this idea of her idea being difficult to understand, but she did have to overcome sort of the misogyny and sexism of pretty much every other scientist she was working with, which for the most part were men and males who probably did look down on her quite disdainingly. But of course, she persisted, and her idea of transposable elements is very much accepted today. And of course, all four of these ideas are very different to what happened beforehand. So Lavoisier went from this idea of substances having phlogiston in them to air reacting. Einstein looking at space-time. Wegener looking at the fact that over millions and billions of years, the Earth changes, and it changes dramatically. And McClintock looking at the idea that not all of your traits come directly from your parents, that genes get mixed up when those things are going on there. And one of the things there is that science, we think of science as being altruistic and being this true representation of everything. Science can be just as political as the rest of society in terms of politics, economics, and all that there. And a brand new idea is really hard to come through. And you can even look there. When we looked at the history of atoms, we're looking there at Democritus coming with those atoms 2,500 years there. You can also look at the ancient Greeks who came up with astronomical ideas, the heliocentric and the geocentric. And for over 2,000 years, the geocentric was accepted because that was what was accepted by the Greeks. It took a lot of evidence for that other stuff to be overcome. Doesn't matter what you do, though. We are, as humans and observers in the universe, the universe doesn't care what we think. And the universe just works as it is. Part of our job in science is trying to uncover how the universe works. And when you start talking about Einstein's relativity, you start talking about quantum mechanics. If you want to go down the path with biology and what is the nature of consciousness, is our personality, is what we are as humans, is that our brain or is it part of our body? And that the universe is weirder than we can think. And in some cases it's probably always going to be weirder than we can ever think of. And one of the things there with that as well is that the more you understand the universe, the more you realize you have no idea how the universe works.